Claudia, now you're up for Audit Committee chairs and the kitchen draw committee, I guess.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about sort of two themes. The SEC's new regulatory philosophy in terms of disclosure and the role of the Audit Committee in oversight of AI. So if we think about, the SEC under Chair Atkins, his focus is on making disclosure less onerous for companies, more decision useful for investors. And so it's important that management be briefing the Audit Committee on what's happening in terms of regulation and trends and the impact on the company. And I think that also means getting briefings for the Audit Committee from legal counsel as well as the auditor on the impacts they see. And so Chair Atkins has called for a comprehensive review of the rules on non-financial disclosures, Regulation SK. And I think we're expecting both substantial and substantive reforms to be proposed. And the first area the SEC is tackling is compensation disclosures. I won't say too much here other than that Chair Atkins has called the rules of Frankenstein patchwork. The next area that the SEC is tackling is quarterly reporting. The president has called for an end to mandatory quarterly reporting. The SEC chair has asked the staff to fast track a rule proposal. And the idea, I think, is essentially to allow companies to report semi-annually rather than quarterly. And so I think it's instructive to look at other countries where this is already in effect. So if we look at the EU and the UK, there are many companies that could report semi-annually, but nonetheless report quarterly due to demand from investors and in some cases other stakeholders. And some of the potential issues to think about now are, what do your investors want? I mean, typically investors want more rather than less. I would also think about, what are competitors providing? And then there's some practical issues. For example, less frequent disclosure could potentially complicate capital raising. There'd be less information in the marketplace. Financials would be older. It would complicate trading windows for insiders. There's a potential for less analyst coverage, as well as, potential in some cases for a negative impact on liquidity. And then I think you would, as a practical matter, also focus in on what your existing debt covenants require. Because for many companies, they're already obligated to provide quarterly information. And then if we think about the chair's, Chair Atkins' philosophy on disclosure, his view is that principles-based disclosure tied to materiality is generally enough. So that's why he, for example, opposes having a new rule on AI disclosure. That's why we are not going to see a new rule on climate out of the SEC. The climate rule is dead. And the prism will be materiality. And then at the same time, for the Audit Committee, you'll be looking at whether you're subject to other mandatory climate disclosures. For example, those in California, the EU, there's a new one in New York. Most of these are being challenged or will be challenged, so there's some uncertainty there. So, if you think about principles-based disclosure, in the absence of prescriptive disclosure, what this means for the Audit Committee is having more dialogue with management on the adequacy of internal controls, disclosure controls, monitoring systems. And then to some degree, underlying all of this is making sure and being comfortable that there's a culture of transparency and proactive compliance with law. And then if we turn to the role of the Audit Committee in oversight of AI, I think all of us get this question a lot. I think the starting place actually is what's the role of the full board? I think there are some issues that really belong at the full board, like impact on the business model, the strategy, the long-term impact on the workforce. And we've seen some companies that originally put oversight of AI in the Audit Committee move all or some of it up to the full board because they recognize that a higher level of oversight, a more intense level of oversight is required. And there's no one committee that really has the bandwidth, to oversee all of this. And I think as a practical matter, eventually all standing committees of the board will have some role to play in the oversight of AI, and structures are likely to be iterative. But if we focus in on the Audit Committee, there are a lot of issues that may well fall to the Audit Committee. starting with compliance with law. AI law is fragmented, evolving, inconsistent, and it's not just laws on AI, it's about privacy, intellectual property, consumer protection. And this affects where and how AI can be used. So this is going to be a difficult area, I think, for audit committees to stay on top of. Another would be the use of AI in preparing financial statements and drafts of SEC filings, other regulatory filings. And this raises the related issue of, does the finance department have the budget, the personnel, and the skills to use these new technologies effectively? And then if we focus in on the external and internal auditors, I think there are a couple of questions here. How are they using AI themselves? And, what do they see as the risks associated with the use of AI in preparing financial statements? And then some of our favorite issues are internal controls, disclosure controls being appropriately updated for, AI agents. Do they reflect the need for greater controls around data? Has ERM been updated to reflect new technology as well as the risks associated with data? And then for an audit committee, which is already overseeing cyber and data privacy, which is a lot of audit committees, you now have to oversee the related issues involving AI and data. And data governance, sort of the umbrella subject, not just data privacy or security, also data ethics, what data is being retained, is often falling to the audit committee. And again, it's sort of the kitchen sink problem, often ends up there by default. But I know I've seen a lot of audit committees focusing in on this subject, in the last 18 months. Again, recognizing that data is the lifeblood of Gen AI. And then there's the issue of how the audit committee coordinates and communicates with the other board committees, the full board, on all of these AI-related matters. And then the basic issue of, does the audit committee have the bandwidth and the skill sets to deal with all of this? On top of all of the other non-financial issues that have been delegated to the audit committee, and making sure that enough time is devoted to the core responsibilities of overseeing financials, auditors, internal controls.
Claudia, I don't want to peel back AI more because I think I've got an idea about bringing that in after everybody gets through the committees. But I should have kept score as to how many times you talked about audit committee bandwidth and skills, because it probably was double digits. And that's a conversation that I think we've had for the last 5 years, 10 years, maybe even 15 years. And when I look at data, public companies on average have slightly more than four committees. NomGov, Audit, and Comp are 3 of the 4. I always got excited when I saw that data, but it turned out that most of the 4th one were either executive committees of boards or finance committees of the boards. Clearly, banks have risk committees, and there's a number of industries that have tech committees. But we really haven't changed the game. And I just reflect on how much can you put in the audit committee, and is question 1. And question 2 is the composition of audit committees really changing in a way that makes those added responsibilities more productive or more valuable for organizations?
Well, I mean, it's the eternal issue. I mean, we have these 3 committee structure largely as a result of, the post-Enron world. And whether it's still fit for purpose, I think, is a discussion that's worth having. Many audit committee chairs will find themselves speaking to the chair of the NomGov committee about the overall workload of the audit committee to see whether it's fit for purpose, and as well as whether there's an optimal allocation of issues to all of the board's standing committees. In terms of the audit committee, there's some things you could do. You could form an ad hoc committee potentially on an issue that's short-lived. You could form a subcommittee. But that gets you to the issue again of should you form a new committee? A tech committee is not a panacea. Boards generally do not like to form new committees, but in some cases it may be appropriate. I think about 13% of the S&P 500 have a tech committee. And if you're thinking about doing that, there are a number of practical issues to consider, like what is it going to do? Is it an innovation committee, a strategy committee? Is it a compliance committee? If you form it, won't you still have some residual responsibilities at the audit committee? And I think the answer to that is yes, of course. And you'll still have issues like impact on the financial statements. And then you have to decide, do you have directors with the skill sets to serve on that new committee? And then there's a practical issue which nobody likes, which is if you run your committee meetings in parallel, you effectively limit who can serve on some of your committees. I do think that audit committees have seen more directors join the committee who have a background in non-financial areas that the audit committee is addressing. And I think that really leaves an important question for audit committees because in some cases they find they only have one or two individuals who have expertise in the traditional core areas of financial statements and controls. And sometimes it's only the chair. And I think that is worth looking at. Is that really adequate? Because committees really need to function as a group, not as an individual. And then we do see knowledge gaps on committees, particularly audit, because it's getting so many new issues. So those need to be addressed in one way or another. You can't oversee something if you don't have the knowledge. So in many cases, that means, engaging outside advisors and then thinking about other solutions like board education, which I think is vital on an ongoing basis, particularly on technology. You might choose to use an advisory board. You might choose to recruit a new director, which ties into what Heather was talking about. But I think it's really very important to look at this because at some companies there's too much in the audit committee, but there's no other place that the audit committee feels would be more appropriate. So one of the other options is to increase the size of the committee so you can divide up the work a little more effectively.